Let's talk about what's wrong with gluten-free diets. But before we do that, let's talk about what's not wrong with gluten-free diets. And I point this out because there are critics of gluten-free diets who don't understand this diet, this way of living, and make pointless criticisms. For instance, they say that a gluten-free diet lacks variety. Well, clearly that's a person who's never eaten gluten-free, because if you are gluten-free, there's still plenty of safe foods. Cucumbers, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, salmon, pork chops, steak, butter, olive oil, lots and lots of healthy foods. Critics of gluten-free diets say that it lacks nutrients. Well, that would be true if you replace gluten-containing foods with things like Kool-Aid, Coca-Cola, and Cheetos. But if you replace gluten-containing foods with real healthy foods, avocados, healthy oils, coconut oil, healthy meats, fish, etc., there is no nutrient deficiency that develops when you eliminate gluten-containing foods. There's no deficiency of B vitamins, folic acid, or any other nutrient. You get all your nutrients just by eating real food, even minus gluten-containing foods. Some people say just lacking grains, removing an entire food group is not good for you. Well, humans spent the first 3.5 million years on this planet without consuming grains. We added grains very recently, just about 10,000 years ago, which is just a moment in anthropological time. And by the way, when we did, there was a dramatic downturn in health that has continued to this day and gotten worse because of the changes introduced into the wheat and grains plants by agribusiness and genetics research. Critics of gluten-free diets also say that there's a lack of fiber. Well, there's a grain of truth in that, forgive the pun, because there is a prebiotic fiber in grains called arabinoxylan. And if you go gluten-free or grain-free, you lose about 3 or 4 grams of that arabinoxylan prebiotic fiber per day. So that actually is not a good thing. But you can easily compensate for that by eating other foods that contain prebiotic fibers, as we do in my programs. Then what is wrong with gluten-free diets? Well, the big mistake made in gluten-free diets is that you replace gluten-containing foods with processed, commercial, gluten-free foods. And those gluten-free bagels, bread, pizza crust, etc., are made with 4 ingredients: cornstarch, rice flour, tapioca starch, and potato flour. Those ingredients are horrible. They're high glycemic index, higher glycemic index than any other food. Because they're a fine powder, that increases the surface area for digestion exponentially. So gluten-free foods send your blood sugar sky high, higher than any other food. And those high blood sugars have very serious consequences when experienced repeatedly, because they induce high blood sugars. That leads to insulin resistance, that leads to type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. It has the effects of glycation, the glucose modification of proteins in the body. Every time blood glucose goes sky high, you glycate the proteins in your body, and that process is irreversible, and it yields debris in your various organs. If you glycate, for instance, the proteins in the lenses of your eyes, you accumulate opacities, cataracts. If you glycate the cartilage proteins in your hips and knees, you get brittle cartilage over time that erodes and leads to bone-on-bone arthritis. If you glycate skin, it thins the skin and causes aging spots and fragility of the skin. If you glycate kidney tissue, it causes kidney disease. There's a long list of health conditions that result from excessive glycation, as results when you consume gluten-free processed foods. Another problem with these gluten-free processed foods is that they disrupt bowel flora because they're in effect sugar. They're just like sugar. The very high carbohydrate content of gluten-free flours disrupts bowel flora. And it leads to 2 very common conditions that's becoming much more common over time: small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO we say, and small intestinal fungal overgrowth, or SIFO. These are conditions in which bowel flora that are supposed to remain mostly in the colon have ascended up into the ileum, jejunum, duodenum, and stomach. Both bacteria and fungi can do this, and it leads to all kinds of health problems. It can express itself as fibromyalgia. It can express itself as irritable bowel syndrome. It can worsen conditions like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and celiac disease. It can lead to other autoimmune conditions and skin rashes. So these are very common conditions, and they're much worsened by consuming gluten-free processed foods. Another problem with gluten-free processed foods is that they can reactivate celiac disease. I cringe when I hear that someone with celiac disease has been just giving a handout to follow a gluten-free diet, or talks to the dietitian who knows almost nothing about how to follow a gluten-free diet and tells people that they should buy gluten-free processed foods. Well, that's a problem, because the corn starch, that's the most common ingredient in gluten-free foods, although it's corn starch, is contaminated by the zein protein of corn. And zein cross-reacts with the gliadin within gluten. So zein has been shown to reactivate celiac disease or allow it to persist. There's another problem ingredient, and that's the rice flour or rice starch. That has wheat germ agglutinin. It's in rice, but it has residues of the wheat germ agglutinin protein that's very toxic to the gastrointestinal tract. If you get a little bit of wheat germ agglutinin, that can actually induce the changes, the destructive changes in the intestinal lining. It looks just like celiac disease, even though it's not mediated by the immune system. So gluten-free foods can reactivate intestinal damage and celiac disease. So what I do in my Wheat Belly lifestyle, as detailed in the Wheat Belly books, Wheat Belly 10-Day Grain Detox book, Wheat Belly Total Health, as well as my Undoctored book, and the Wheat Belly blog, Undoctored blog, we talk about how to be grain-free as well as being gluten-free, okay? Being grain-free is even better. You avoid gluten-containing foods made from wheat, rye, barley, and some of the zein protein of corn, but we go further by buying grain-free, and that yields even bigger, better results. Now, it doesn't mean you'll never have a pizza. It doesn't mean you'll never have nice cupcakes or a birthday cake or a pizza crust or pie. That's what we do in the Wheat Belly lifestyle. We recreate these kinds of fun foods, but we use healthy ingredients. We don't use the garbage gluten-free processed ingredients like cornstarch or rice flour or tapioca starch. We use ingredients like almond flour or almond meal, or coconut flour, or ground golden flaxseed, or other nut meals and flours. And you can recreate delicious foods. And we also, by the way, use natural non-caloric sweeteners, not synthetic sweeteners like aspartame. We use natural non-caloric sweeteners like stevia and monk fruit. And just by following these basic ideas, you can recreate all kinds of great foods. You won't encounter all the destructive, harmful, terrible effects of gluten-free processed foods. So you can be gluten-free and do quite well. Just don't go for the processed gluten-free garbage ingredients. Instead, recreate your own foods by using benign ingredients like we do in the Wheat Belly lifestyle.